Mr. Chairman, Professor Kadivar. Greetings to you all. I concur on many points that Safdar expressed, and I enjoyed the talk by Professor Musa. And like him, I am a scientist, a physicist by training and by profession. But I have certain definite views on this subject, which I will present to you. I'll try and give a synopsis of my talk in 2 minutes so you know where I am leading. In this talk, I shall argue that the prevailing ideas and the understanding of modernism and secularism are founded on an analogy which is flawed on many accounts. I shall also point out an all-important fact which often does not receive the attention it deserves, namely that the most distinct characteristic of modernism is a faith in modern science. This point might have been considered controversial 100 years ago, but it no longer is. I shall also consider the idea that religion has had many of its values adopted by secularism for secularism's own use. That secularism is religion in disguise. And I draw attention to the auspicious implications that this can have for the so-called Islamic secularism, provided it avoids the pitfalls that have afflicted the Christian version, because it is often ignored that all secularism initially began as religious secularism. I shall conclude by offering a way out of this predicament. The fact that Islam poses a range of problems in the contemporary world is an obvious one, which becomes all the more conspicuous when one considers the great achievements of the modern world in other spheres. We now have a European Union of countries that were historical enemies. We now have a black man in the White House. We now have a planetary telephone system, otherwise known as the Internet, and many other achievements which are now taken for granted but were generally considered unthinkable before. While it is true, as any observer of the Muslim world, their media and their schools and universities would affirm, that many contemporary Muslims have already adopted many of the modern Western mores and wants, and while it is also true that in the West, the poems of Rumi and Omar Khayyam, as well as the monuments Taj Mahal and Alhambra, and the Islamic art and culture which they represent are admired, it is indeed paradoxical that nonetheless the question, what is wrong with Islam, should be asked again and again. Moreover, given the readiness of the modern West to export its package of reform and progress, and given the attractions of such package, why should the Muslim world resist this package? This is a very interesting question. I submit that without taking proper account of some deep inconsistencies between Islam and modernism on the foundational level, any answer to the above question, and indeed many of the questions addressed by this symposium, will not be complete, for the simple reason that political problems are the symptoms, one might say, of the underlying philosophical diseases. The impediments to modernization and secularization have theoretical roots, and most people in the Muslim world, although they may not be able to articulate them, instinctively perceive them, just as they perceive the problems of the old and existing systems. One can also hope that once the incompatibilities are clearly exposed, it will indeed be possible to find a way out of the impasse. Now, the problems themselves are not really well defined. Even the most basic terms are not well defined. For example, the term modern and its derivatives are understood and utilized in so many different senses, ranging from contemporary to innovative or advanced or efficient or successful or fashionable. But often it does not mean any of these. Rather, it refers to a period which followed the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, and that is the sense I'm using it primarily. And on a yet deeper level, it relates to a period characterized by a very particular worldview, which was born as a result of the works of such men as Nicolas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and of course, René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. and was nurtured in part by Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud, thus laying the foundation for both modern physical and biological science as well as psychology. Thus, it is very important to take note of this fact. Modernity has ever had a hallmark and a sine qua non, namely a strong faith in modern science. And I mean faith when I say faith. I shall come back to an important implication of this point toward the end of this talk. Since the very beginning, this new worldview heavily leaned towards rationalism, deism, as opposed to theism, humanism and anthropocentrism, and it was said to break off from the transcendent, from the sacred, and from the immutable principles which were commonly believed to be ruling over all things. In this sense, to modernize, in simple, clear, honest terms, means to cut off from revelation. Drawing attention to this fact need not cause consternation. On the contrary, being conscious of it will save the Muslim reformers and the great congregation who are to be reformed a great deal of trouble. Also, the key term secularism is derived from the Latin, as many of you would know, secularis, from seculum, which had the sense of generation, age, or period, and used in Christian Latin to mean the world. Also, in its technical sense, secular clergy originally meant such Catholic clergy that were not members of a monastic order, whilst regular clergy did. But later it came to be identified with laity, which itself acquired different meanings in Catholicism and Anglicanism. Nowadays it is of course mostly used in the sense as non-religious or dispensed with the clergy services or separation of the church from the state. But people have a difficult time trying to translate this term into Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Turkish, etc. In Turkish and often in Persian, essentially the same word, secularism, is used. Sometimes in Persian, the term laïc, which is really French, from laïcité, is used. And in Urdu, as Dr. Safdar Ahmad pointed out, first time it was coined by Maududi, the more candid la diniya, which is not far off the mark if we remember that the man who is credited with the coining of the term secularist in its current sense, namely George Holyoake, though himself an atheist, but took the following position in this respect: neither affirm nor deny God, but ignore him, then it's not that surprising that Maududi used that word after all. As for Arabic, the term Almaniya is invented, and 50 years ago most Arabic-speaking people would have not known what that term meant. In fact, it is not accidental that the translations are so problematic. The explanation is that this understanding is based on an analogy, but the analogy is flawed on several accounts. First of all, with the exception of the case of modern Iran, the class and organization of clergy does not exist in Islam. And in this sense, Islam has been completely secular all along. As Sayyid Hossein Nasr put it, there is no official sacerdotal authority, no magisterium in Islam, in his book, The Heart of Islam. Second, schism and Protestantism did not occur in Islam in the same way that it happened in Christendom. One might erroneously assume that Shiism is a form of Protestant Islam. But see Hamid Enayat's book, Modern Islamic Political Thought, quoting Hamid Algar, also Sayyid Hossein Nasr, his recent valuable talk at Harvard Seminary, entitled Shiism and Sunnism, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Also Friedrich Schön, Islam and the Perennial Philosophy. Third, there was never controversy or crisis regarding the translation of the Quran or its accessibility to the public at large, in sharp contrast to the events associated with the translations of the Bible by John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. Fourth, there were no theological wars of the same kind as in Europe. for the obvious reason that there was no Protestantism. The cases of Salahuddin Ayyubi and the Fatimids, or the Ottomans and the Safavids, were not really theological wars. Fifth, and most notably, Islamic science never arose to confront the official interpretations of the Holy Scripture and the Orthodoxy. Also, unlike the New Testament, in which there are instructions such as give unto God what is God's and give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and where therefore there was need to borrow from the Greco-Roman and Anglo-Saxon common law, the Quran lays down exact and explicit laws regarding such matters as interest on money lent and division of inheritance between heirs, etc. So, with all this, has there been anything to come close to forming a sound analogy? Well, simple answer is yes, nonetheless, yes. Concerning the root word seculum, which meant generation, age, or period, or the world, there's a similar word dahr, literally time, which occurs disapprovingly in the Quran, notably in chapter 45, verse 24. And they say, there is naught but our life of the world. We die and we live, and naught destroys us save time. When they have no knowledge whatsoever of all that, they do but guess. This was the verse. And which has philosophical and naturalistic connotations. However, the greatest challenge which came from within the core of the world of Islam was that of the philosophers and the Mu'tazilite school, to which, again, Dr. Safdar referred, which nonetheless had differences. The philosophers and the Mu'tazilites had subtle differences among themselves, which by and large was arguably inspired to some extent by the same source as that which inspired the pioneers of secularism in the West. They too had strong rationalistic and deistic tendencies. In fact, it is well known that it was through them that the Greek legacy reached the European Renaissance thinkers. The fact that they were unable to bring about the same phenomenon in their own world, that is the Islamic world, further corroborates the inappropriateness of the analogy that I mentioned in the foregoing. It also highlights the need for re-examining the assumption that the desired reform in the Islamic world must be modeled on that which was implemented in the modern West. I mentioned the exact and explicit Quranic injunctions. By contrast, the lack of any such injunctions regarding the details of the form of government in the Quran is very significant, so that experts like Professor Kadivar could in principle have a broad scope in their work. However, another relevant point here, which is often ignored, not without good reason, concerns two very different views on the role of the Muslim reformers. The Muslim reformers in their own eyes, and the Muslim reformers in the eyes of their Western patrons. The reformers, or at least some of them, seem to regard themselves as revivers, renewers, healers, and rectifiers, who are serving the true ideals of Islam. Certainly the mentor of Professor Kadivar, the late Ayatollah Montazeri, and the mentor of Professor Al-Na'im, as he relates himself, would have not for a moment contemplated differently. But there is compelling evidence that the Western supporters, especially those wielding economic and political power, have different motives. This is counterproductive as far as genuine reform is concerned. The heart of the matter is that the Islamic civilization is a civilization that had a rich science, rich metaphysics, marvelous art, a richly developed law, its brand of multiculturalism and human rights, and even its own tradition of renewal and renewers, mujaddid, like Al-Ghazali, and supremely original, innovative reformers like Rumi. That explains why the Muslim world still resolutely intends to be itself and to assert itself. It also explains why it has been so unsuccessful in achieving substantial reform, because there are two modes of reform. One existing but dormant, and another trying to impose itself from outside, and the two interfere more often than not destructively. Even in physics, sometimes we get light and light giving darkness. That's what happens in the phenomenon of diffraction. At any rate, viewed in this light, true reform as opposed to deform cannot result from exportation or intervention, but rather from transaction with the modern Western civilization. And transaction will require acknowledgement of all the above-mentioned facts. Also, it will require the existence of men or groups of men who have deep and broad knowledge and understanding of both civilizations. The fact that until recently there were no Muslim Occidentalists accounts for much of the problem stated at the outset. You have had Western Orientalists, but how many Eastern Occidentalists? Now, many ulamas had inadequate knowledge of the modern West, and sometimes even of Islam itself, is well known, and there's a great tendency to ascribe the source of almost all problems to such inadequacy. However, in the face of the formidable body of work on Islam by Western Orientalists, their inadequacy is not as widely addressed. I give you a few examples to make this point clear. In George Sale's translation of the Quran, which is incidentally the one on which the congressman that you have in America, Keith Ellison, swore in. It was donated to the Congress by Thomas Jefferson. In George Sale comments that the reason for naming the 38th Surah Sad may be that it sounds for Solomon, betraying his ignorance of the difference between Sin and Sad. And he translated the Quran, and it's the Quran which is still used to swear in when Keith Ellison is elected to the Congress. Another example, as Nuh Keller has pointed out, the great French Orientalist Louis Massignon mistakes Yashku for Yashoku in Abdurrahman al-Majzoub's poetry, which means he does not appreciate the meaning or even the poetic meter. And he calls the Sufi poet morose and haughty. This, despite the greatness of Louis Massignon. Thank you. I have had less than 20 minutes if you just give me another few minutes. A similar example is Reynold Nicholson's translation of Khayal in Rumi's Masnavi as fantasy and elsewhere as imagination and fancy. And Murtaza Mutahari also in his introduction to the Principles of Philosophy quotes absurd errors made by Comte Gobineau and Edward Brown. And finally, those of us, I'll wrap it up in a few minutes. And finally, those of us who have studied modern science proper and philosophy of science, who have pondered over the Einstein's relativity theories and much more importantly, the significance of the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, the Russell paradox, and the famous Gödel's incompleteness theorem in modern logic, those of us who have first-hand experience of the disillusionment with the Newtonian clockwork universe, which provided the worldview with pioneers of secularism in the West thought and wrote, and those of us who have had our eyes opened by Kuhnian indication of the concepts of paradigm in the original sense that Kuhn used it himself, paradigm shift and normal science, and the scientism, which is really a form of metaphysics in the guise of physics. And I really recommend P.C.W. Davis's article, Taking Science on Faith, in the New York Times, November 2007. It will be of great service. To such of us who have known these, it is unconscionable even to consider abandoning such rich tradition as has produced fruits like Rumi and Hafiz and Khayyam. On the contrary, we consider it our debt to humanity, including ourselves, that we uncover the treasures bequeathed to us by our authentic tradition and invest them in whatever it takes to save the outer environment as well as our inner souls. Life's sacredness, man's honor, and the love of neighbor, including a possibly ignorant or hostile neighbor, all become intelligible in a system of culture and cosmology which has a vice-regal view of man. One which has the means to allow man to experience this knowledge also. Evidently, Islamic mysticism is the best candidate for being the common language between Islam and the modern world, because on the one hand, by putting the emphasis on self-purification, it saves the Muslims from irrelevancies and mirages, such as calling for the implementation of the Sharia in Western countries, in which many of them have sought economic and political refuge. And on the other hand, it provides the spiritual and intellectual nourishment and the freedom from the internal limitations of the ego that plague both modern society and the environment. According to the above worldview, every child is born in the state of primordial nature or in the religion of love, because even every newborn understands beauty and goodness and loves beauty and goodness. And all the world's great religions, whose cores are the same according to the explicit text of the Quran, have been sent down from on high in order to restore and amplify that primordial nature. Such universalist worldview explains why even secular constitutions sanction the life, honor, and freedom of man. An explanation that secularism in its non-religious sense clearly lacks and must content itself with one which is at best utilitarian or conventional. Thus wrote St. Paul to Romans, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature what the law requires, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Romans chapter 2, verses 14, 15. And let me end to your happiness and satisfaction with a line of Masnavi, Rumi, book 4, verse 1194. If you permit me, I'll say it in Persian. You allow me one line in Persian. خلق ما بر صورت خود کرد حق وصف او بر وصف ما گیرد سبق, which means God created us in his image. Our qualities are instructed by his qualities, or our qualities are modeled upon his qualities. Thank you.